The December wind off Lake Erie cut through Rich Stadium like a frozen razor blade as 19-year-old Bobby Kowalski climbed the concrete steps toward the upper deck, clutching a $7 ticket that represented everything he'd saved from his part-time job at the steel mill in South Buffalo. It was December 16, 1973, the final game of the NFL season, and Bobby was about to witness something that would change his understanding of what it meant to fight for greatness when everything seemed stacked against you. The Buffalo Bills versus the New York Jets. A meaningless game for both teams. The Bills were 9-4 and out of playoff contention. The Jets were 4-9 and playing out the string. But for O.J. Simpson, the Bills' running back who'd been chasing NFL history all season, this game represented his last chance to become the first player in professional football history to rush for 2,000 yards in a single season. Bobby had grown up in Kaisertown, a Polish-American neighborhood in South Buffalo, where his father worked the blast furnaces at Bethlehem Steel, and his mother cleaned houses for families in the suburbs who could afford domestic help. The Bills weren't just entertainment in the Kowalski household. They were proof that Buffalo, a city everyone else seemed to write off as a decaying Rust Belt casualty, could produce something excellent, something worthy of national attention. The 1973 season had been magical for Buffalo football fans. O.J. Simpson, in his fifth NFL season, had finally found the right combination of offensive line, coaching scheme, and personal determination to unleash the athletic brilliance that had made him a legend at USC. Game after game, Simpson had shredded opposing defenses with a combination of speed, vision, and an almost supernatural ability to find holes in defensive formations that seemed impenetrable. But heading into the final week of the season, Simpson still needed 61 yards to reach the 2,000-yard milestone. 61 yards in a single game should have been routine for a back who'd averaged over 140 yards per game throughout the season. The problem was the weather. Buffalo in December was always brutal, but December 16, 1973 was something special. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, with winds gusting up to 35 miles per hour, and a freezing rain that had turned Rich Stadium's artificial turf into something resembling an ice rink covered with mud. These were conditions that made running the football not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. Bobby's ticket was for Section 341, Row 28, Seat 14, so far from the field that the players looked like action figures moving around a board game. But he was inside Rich Stadium on the day when Buffalo's greatest athlete had a chance to make history, and that felt like participation in something larger than his normal routine of high school classes, part-time work, and dreams of escape from a city that seemed to offer limited opportunities for young people. The stadium was packed despite the brutal conditions, 206 people who'd braved the weather because they understood they might be witnessing something unprecedented in professional football. These weren't casual fans looking for entertainment. These were people who'd invested emotionally and financially in being present when their city's greatest representative faced his biggest test. "First Bills game?" asked the man sitting next to Bobby, a guy who looked to be in his 40s and was wearing a Bills jacket that had clearly seen better years. "First NFL game, period," Bobby replied, pulling his knit cap down over his ears as another gust of wind ripped through the stadium. "Been following O.J. all season, but never had the money for tickets." "I'm Stan Kowalski. Yeah, same last name. Probably cousins somewhere back in Poland," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "Been coming to Bills games since they played in the old War Memorial Stadium. You picked a hell of a day to start. History in the making, if the weather doesn't kill us first." As they talked, Bobby learned that Stan was a supervisor at Republic Steel who'd maintained season tickets through decades of financial struggle, because he understood that Bills football represented something essential about Buffalo identity. These tickets weren't entertainment expenses. They were investments in civic pride, proof that working-class people could witness greatness if they were willing to sacrifice other comforts. "What do you think about OJ's chances today?" Bobby asked, as they watched the teams warm up on the field below. Stan studied the conditions with the expression of someone who'd seen enough buffalo weather to understand its impact on football. 61 yards should be easy for OJ, he said. But look at that field. It's a skating rink covered with mud. Every step's going to be an adventure. It was true. Even from the upper deck, Bobby could see that the artificial turf was covered with a thin layer of ice that had formed when the freezing rain hit the cold surface. Players were slipping during warm-ups, struggling to maintain their footing on a surface that looked more suited to ice hockey than professional football. But it was OJ Simpson's demeanor during warm-ups that caught Bobby's attention. The running back, normally fluid and graceful in his movements, was taking careful steps, testing the surface, clearly understanding that every carry would require not just athletic ability, but courage. One wrong step, one moment of lost footing, could end not just his record chase, but potentially his career. "Look at OJ," Bobby said to Stan during a break in the pre-game activities. "He looks focused." "He should be focused," Stan replied. "This might be his only shot at 2,000 yards. No running back's ever done it before, and with conditions like this, it's gonna take everything he's got." The pre-game ceremonies felt more emotional than usual, with Bills fans understanding they might be witnessing a piece of NFL history. When Simpson's name was announced during introductions, the ovation was thunderous and sustained, carrying the weight of appreciation for everything he'd meant to the franchise and the city. But as the game began, it became clear that the weather conditions were going to make every yard a battle. The Jets, playing with nothing to lose and understanding that their primary goal was preventing Simpson from reaching his milestone, were stacking 8 and 9 defenders near the line of scrimmage, daring the Bills to try running into what looked like human walls. Simpson's first carry of the game netted 2 yards, but more importantly, it showed Bobby and everyone else in the stadium what this record attempt was going to look like. When Simpson was tackled, he slid an additional 5 yards on the icy surface, his uniform immediately picking up mud and ice that would accumulate throughout the game. "This is going to be ugly," Stan said, as Simpson slowly got to his feet after his second carry, which had gained 3 yards but left him covered in more mud. He's going to have to earn every yard the hard way. By the end of the first quarter, Simpson had carried the ball 6 times for 18 yards, and his uniform was already barely recognizable. The iconic white Bills jersey with the red numbers was now a canvas of mud, grass stains, and ice, creating a visual representation of the battle he was fighting against both the Jets' defense and the elements. But it was Simpson's attitude that impressed Bobby most. After each carry, after each tackle that left him covered in more mud, the running back would get up, brush himself off as much as possible, and return to the huddle with the same determination he'd shown during his record-breaking games on perfect autumn afternoons. "Look at him," Bobby said to Stan, as Simpson completed a 7-yard run that brought his total to 25 yards. "He's not complaining about the conditions, not making excuses. He's just fighting for every yard." "That's what separates great players from everyone else," Stan replied. "When conditions are perfect, lots of guys can look good. When everything's working against you, champions find ways to keep performing." The second quarter brought more of the same, methodical, grinding football that bore no resemblance to the highlight reel performances that had characterized Simpson's season. Every carry was a struggle. Every yard was earned through determination, rather than athletic brilliance. But Bobby found himself becoming fascinated by the visual story being told by Simpson's uniform. With each carry, with each tackle, with each slide across the icy surface, the mud accumulated like layers of history. By halftime, Simpson's jersey was completely transformed. No longer the clean white uniform he'd worn during introductions, but a brown, muddy testament to the battle he was fighting. 36 yards at halftime, Stan announced, checking his scorecard. 25 yards to go. Think he'll make it? If he stays healthy, yeah. But look at him. He's taking a beating out there. Every hit on that surface is like getting tackled on concrete. As the teams headed to their locker rooms for halftime, Bobby realized he was witnessing something that transcended normal categories of athletic achievement. This wasn't just about rushing for 2,000 yards. This was about refusing to let circumstances dictate outcomes, about fighting for excellence even when every external factor seemed designed to prevent success. The mud on Simpson's jersey was becoming the visual representation of that struggle, and Bobby understood that regardless of whether the running back reached his milestone, he was watching a demonstration of what greatness looked like when everything was working against you. The second half was still to come, and 25 yards had never seemed like such a monumental challenge. The third quarter began with O.J. Simpson needing 25 yards to reach 2,000 for the season. But as Bobby Kowalski watched from section 341, it was clear that those remaining yards would be among the most difficult of Simpson's career. The weather conditions at Rich Stadium had deteriorated even further during halftime, with the freezing rain continuing to coat the artificial turf with a layer of ice that made every step treacherous. "Look at that field," Stan Kowalski said, pointing toward the playing surface that glistened under the stadium lights. "It's like a hockey rink. How's anyone supposed to run on that?" Bobby studied Simpson's warm-up routine before the second half and saw a player who understood exactly what he was facing. The running back was taking careful, deliberate steps, testing his footing, clearly aware that one wrong move could send him sliding helplessly across the icy surface. But it was Simpson's uniform that told the real story of what the first half had cost him. The White Bills jersey was now completely brown with mud, the red numbers barely visible beneath layers of dirt and ice. His pants were similarly transformed, and even his helmet showed the evidence of multiple collisions with the frozen ground. "He looks like he's been in a war," Bobby observed. "He has been in a war," Stan replied. 36 yards in 2 quarters, on a day when most running backs would be lucky to stay upright. And he's got to do it all over again for 2 more quarters. The Jets, understanding that they were playing the role of spoilers in a potential historic moment, came out for the second half with renewed determination to prevent Simpson from reaching his milestone. Their defensive coordinator had clearly made adjustments during halftime, packing even more defenders near the line of scrimmage and daring the Bills to try anything other than handing the ball to their star running back. Simpson's first carry of the third quarter epitomized everything that was making this record chase so difficult. The handoff from Joe Ferguson was clean, but as soon as Simpson hit the line of scrimmage, he was met by what seemed like the entire Jets' defense. The collision sent him sliding backward on the icy surface, and when he finally came to rest, he'd lost 2 yards and was covered in so much mud that his jersey number was completely obscured. "That's not football," Bobby said, watching Simpson slowly extract himself from what looked like a human pile-up on an ice rink. "That's survival." But Simpson's response to the lost yardage was what impressed Bobby most. The running back didn't complain to the officials about the conditions, didn't argue with his coaches about the play calling, didn't show any sign of frustration about the impossible circumstances he was facing. He simply got up, brushed off as much mud as possible, and returned to the huddle ready for the next play. "Look at his face," Stan said, as the television cameras caught a close-up of Simpson during a timeout. "He's not thinking about how hard this is. He's thinking about how to get those 27 yards. The next several carries unfolded with the kind of methodical determination that separated great athletes from merely talented ones. Simpson would take the handoff, fight through defensive lines that seemed designed specifically to stop him, gain 2 or 3 yards through pure will, and then get up to do it again. With each carry, his uniform became more unrecognizable. The mud wasn't just accumulating on his jersey, it was caking onto every piece of equipment, weighing him down, making every movement more difficult. His face mask was coated with dirt. His gloves were brown with mud, and his shoes were picking up additional weight with every step. "He's carrying an extra 10 pounds of mud," Bobby said, as Simpson completed a 4-yard run that brought his total to 43 yards. "How's he supposed to run fast with all that weight?" "He's not running fast anymore," Stan observed. "He's just running determined." By the end of the third quarter, Simpson had reached 52 yards for the game, leaving him just 9 yards short of the historic milestone. But those 9 yards felt like 9 miles, given the conditions and the Jets' determination to prevent him from reaching 2,000. More importantly, Simpson looked exhausted in ways that went beyond normal football fatigue. The constant battle against the weather, the accumulated weight of the mud on his uniform, the repeated collisions with defenders on an unforgiving surface. All of it was taking a toll that was visible even from the upper deck. 9 yards, Bobby said, as the teams prepared for the fourth quarter. 9 yards for immortality. 9 yards that might as well be 900 in these conditions, Stan replied. But as the fourth quarter began, something remarkable started to happen. The Bills' offensive line, which had been struggling to create running lanes throughout the game, began to assert themselves with renewed determination. Whether it was inspiration from watching their star running back refuse to quit, or simple recognition that they were on the verge of being part of history, the linemen started creating holes that hadn't existed in the first 3 quarters. Simpson's first carry of the fourth quarter gained 6 yards, bringing him within 3 yards of the record. But more importantly, it was the first time all day that he'd run with something approaching his normal fluidity, despite the conditions and the accumulated mud that covered his uniform. "That looked like the old O.J., Bobby said, as Simpson got up from the tackle with what might have been a smile visible beneath his mud-caked face mask. 3 yards, Stan said, his voice carrying the kind of anticipation that marked truly historic sporting moments. 3 yards from something that's never been done before. The crowd at Rich Stadium had reached fever pitch despite the brutal conditions. 46,000 people were on their feet, creating a wall of sound that seemed to push against the wind and freezing rain. These fans understood they were potentially witnessing history, and they were willing to endure frostbite and hypothermia to be present for O.J. Simpson's moment of glory. But it was Simpson's next carry that provided the defining image of the entire record chase. Taking the handoff from Ferguson, he hit the line of scrimmage and was immediately met by 3 Jets defenders. The collision occurred right at the goal line marker, and for a moment it was impossible to tell whether Simpson had gained the necessary yardage or been stopped short. When the pile finally cleared and the officials began measuring for a first down, Simpson was lying on his back, completely covered in mud, looking like he'd been buried and then excavated. His uniform was now unrecognizable, a brown, shapeless mass that bore no resemblance to the clean white jersey he'd worn during introductions. "Did he get it?" Bobby asked, straining to see the official's measurement from Section 341. The answer came when the public address announcer's voice echoed through Rich Stadium. "Ladies and gentlemen, with that carry, O.J. Simpson has become the first player in NFL history to rush for 2,000 yards in a single season." The explosion of sound that followed was unlike anything Bobby had ever experienced. 46,000 people erupted simultaneously, creating a noise that seemed to shake the stadium's steel framework. Players were hugging, coaches were celebrating, and fans were crying with joy despite the freezing conditions. But it was the image of Simpson struggling to his feet after reaching the milestone that would stay with Bobby forever. The running back was so covered in mud that he was barely recognizable as human, let alone as one of the greatest athletes in professional sports. His jersey was brown, his pants were brown, his helmet was brown, everything except his smile, which was visible even through the mud that covered his face. "Look at him," Stan said, pointing towards Simpson as he was mobbed by his teammates. "He looks like he's been digging ditches, not playing football." "That's what 2,000 yards in these conditions looks like," Bobby replied. "That's what refusing to quit looks like when everything's working against you." As the celebration continued around them and Simpson was carried off the field by his teammates, Bobby realized he'd witnessed something that transcended normal categories of athletic achievement. This hadn't just been about reaching a statistical milestone. This had been a demonstration of what was possible when someone refused to let circumstances dictate outcomes. The mud on Simpson's jersey had become the visual representation of that struggle, proof that greatness sometimes emerged not from perfect conditions, but from the willingness to fight for excellence when everything seemed designed to prevent success. Bobby would remember the numbers, 2,003 yards, an NFL record that would stand for over a decade. But he would remember the mud even more vividly, the physical evidence of what it cost to achieve something that had never been done before when conditions made it almost impossible to achieve. The final statistics from December 16, 1973, would show that O.J. Simpson rushed for 200 yards on 34 carries, finishing the season with 2,003 yards and becoming the first player in NFL history to break the 2,000-yard barrier. But as Bobby Kowalski sat in Section 341 watching the post-game celebration, those numbers felt almost secondary to the visual story that had unfolded throughout the afternoon. 2,003 yards, Stan Kowalski said, checking his scorecard one final time. First man in history to do it. "Yeah," Bobby replied, "but look at what it cost him." Down on the field, O.J. Simpson was conducting interviews with reporters who'd braved the weather conditions to document this historic moment. But the running back they were interviewing looked nothing like the polished athlete who'd appeared in countless television commercials and magazine advertisements throughout his career. Simpson's uniform was completely unrecognizable. What had started the game as a clean white Bills jersey with red numbers had been transformed into a brown, muddy testament to the battle he'd fought against both the Jets' defense and the brutal weather conditions. His helmet was caked with dirt, his face mask was coated with mud, and his shoes had accumulated so much ice and debris that they looked like they weighed 20 pounds each. "He's gonna need a chisel to get that mud off his uniform," Bobby observed as television cameras captured close-up shots of Simpson's post-game interviews. But it was Simpson's demeanor during those interviews that impressed Bobby most. Despite being exhausted, despite being covered head to toe in mud, despite having just endured one of the most physically punishing games in NFL history, the running back was smiling, gracious, clearly understanding the historical significance of what he'd accomplished. "How do you feel about becoming the first 2,000-yard rusher?" one reporter asked. "I feel blessed," Simpson replied, his voice hoarse from the cold and the physical exertion. "This was a team effort. My offensive line, the coaching staff, everyone who believed we could do this, despite the conditions. Was this the most difficult game of your career?" Simpson laughed, gesturing toward his mud-covered uniform. "Look at me. Does it look like it was easy? But that's what made it special. Anyone can run for big yards when conditions are perfect. Today we proved you can make history even when everything's working against you." Bobby found himself thinking about Simpson's words as the crowd began its slow exodus from Rich Stadium. The running back had accomplished something unprecedented in professional football, but he'd done it under conditions that made the achievement seem almost superhuman. "Think anyone will ever break his record?" Bobby asked Stan as they prepared to leave their seats. "Maybe," Stan replied, "but I guarantee you nobody will ever break it looking like that." What we saw today wasn't just football. It was a demonstration of what happens when someone refuses to let circumstances defeat them. The walk down from Section 341 gave Bobby time to process what he'd witnessed. This hadn't been the kind of highlight reel performance that typically characterized record-breaking athletic achievements. There had been no long touchdown runs, no spectacular displays of speed or agility. Instead, it had been 3 hours of methodical determination, with every yard earned through will rather than athletic brilliance. The bus ride back to South Buffalo was filled with excited conversations about Simpson's achievement, but Bobby found himself thinking less about the statistical milestone and more about the visual evidence of what it had cost. The image of Simpson's mud-covered uniform would stay with him longer than any specific run or any particular yardage total. When Bobby arrived home in Kaisertown, he found his father waiting in the living room with the evening newspaper, which already featured headlines about Simpson's historic achievement. "How was the game?" Walter Kowalski asked, looking up from the sports section. "Incredible," Bobby replied, sitting down across from his father. "OJ got his 2,000 yards, but Dad, you should have seen what he looked like by the end. Completely covered in mud. You couldn't even read his jersey number." Walter studied his son's face and saw the kind of excitement that came from witnessing something truly significant. "Sounds like he earned every yard." That's exactly what it was like. Every single yard was a fight. The field was like ice. The Jets were putting 8 guys in the box every play, and OJ just kept getting up and running again. By the 4th quarter, he looked like he'd been digging ditches instead of playing football. "And that impressed you more than the record itself?" Bobby thought about his father's question. Why had the mud on Simpson's uniform resonated with him more than the historic statistical achievement? "I guess it showed me what greatness really looks like," Bobby said finally. "It's not about making things look easy. It's about refusing to quit when everything's working against you. OJ could have made excuses about the weather, could have said the conditions made it impossible. Instead, he just kept fighting for every yard." Walter nodded with the understanding of someone who'd spent 30 years working in steel mills, who knew what it meant to persevere through difficult conditions. "Sometimes the most important victories are the ugly ones," he said. "Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to accomplish something worthwhile." Over the following days, as the sports media celebrated Simpson's achievement and analyzed its significance for professional football, Bobby found himself thinking constantly about the visual story that had unfolded at Rich Stadium. The record would be remembered forever, but the mud-covered uniform represented something deeper about the price of excellence. The experience shaped Bobby's approach to challenges in his own life in ways that became clear over the following months and years. When he faced difficult situations at work, when he encountered obstacles that seemed overwhelming, when he was tempted to make excuses about circumstances beyond his control, he found himself thinking about O.J. Simpson's mud-covered jersey and the determination it represented. "You know what I learned that day?" Bobby would tell his children years later when they asked about his most memorable sporting event. "I learned that achieving something great isn't about having perfect conditions. It's about refusing to let difficult circumstances prevent you from doing what you set out to do." Bobby did eventually leave the steel mill, using the work ethic he'd observed in Simpson's record-breaking performance to build a successful small business in Buffalo. Throughout his career, he tried to apply the lessons he'd learned from that December afternoon, the understanding that excellence required persistence through difficult conditions, that great achievements often looked less glamorous than people expected. In 1994, when the O.J. Simpson murder trial dominated national headlines. Bobby found himself thinking back to that day in 1973, trying to reconcile the determined athlete he'd watched battle through impossible conditions with the person accused of horrific crimes. It was a reminder that athletic greatness didn't necessarily translate to moral character, but it didn't diminish the lesson he'd learned about perseverance and determination. The 2,000-yard record stood as an NFL milestone for years, eventually broken by Eric Dickerson in 1984 under much more favorable conditions. But Bobby always maintained that no one would ever break the record the way Simpson had, through pure determination in conditions that made every yard a battle. When Bobby died in 2018 at age 64 after a long battle with cancer, his family found among his possessions a newspaper clipping from December 17, 1973, with the headline, "OJ Makes History." The clipping was yellowed and fragile, but Bobby had preserved it for 45 years as a reminder of what he'd witnessed. Attached to the clipping was a handwritten note in Bobby's careful script. December 16, 1973, the day I learned that greatness isn't about making things look easy. It's about refusing to quit when everything's working against you. OJ's uniform was covered in mud, but his determination was spotless. Sometimes the most important victories are the ugly ones. The story of O.J. Simpson's 2,000-yard season became part of NFL folklore, celebrated as one of the greatest individual achievements in professional football history. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the battle against impossible conditions, who had seen what determination looked like when everything was working against success, the muddy uniform remained the most powerful symbol of what had been accomplished. Bobby Kowalski had spent $7 to watch a football game, and instead had witnessed a demonstration of what was possible when someone refused to let circumstances dictate outcomes. He had learned that excellence often emerged not from perfect conditions, but from the willingness to fight for your goals, regardless of the obstacles. The record was impressive, but the mud was unforgettable. And sometimes the visual evidence of struggle teaches more valuable lessons than the statistical evidence of success. 3 days after O.J. Simpson's historic achievement, Bobby Kowalski was still processing what he'd witnessed at Rich Stadium. The sports world had moved on to analyzing the significance of the 2,000-yard milestone, debating whether Simpson was now the greatest running back in NFL history, and speculating about what this meant for the future of professional football. But Bobby found himself thinking less about the record and more about the lesson he'd learned about the relationship between determination and achievement. At work that week, loading steel at the Bethlehem plant, where he'd been employed part-time since his junior year of high school, Bobby found himself constantly interrupted by co-workers who wanted to hear about the game from someone who'd actually been there. Word had spread throughout the plant that young Kowalski had witnessed Simpson's record-breaking performance, and everyone wanted details from an eyewitness. "What was it like?" his supervisor, Mike Wojcik, asked during a break in the loading schedule. "I mean, really, what was it like to see history being made?" Bobby thought about the question while they shared coffee from the thermos his mother had packed that morning. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there that you'd witnessed something that transcended normal categories of athletic achievement? How do you describe the moment when determination triumphed over impossible circumstances? "It was incredible," Bobby said finally, "but not in the way you'd expect. O.J. didn't look like a superstar out there. He looked like a guy fighting for his life on every single play. By the end of the game, you couldn't even see his jersey number through all the mud." "The mud was that bad?" "Mike, I've never seen anything like it. The field was basically an ice rink covered with dirt. Every time O.J. got tackled, he'd slide another 5 yards and pick up more mud. By the fourth quarter, he looked like he'd been working construction instead of playing football." Mike nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd spent 20 years doing physical labor, who knew what it meant to get dirty while accomplishing something important. Sounds like he earned that record the hard way. That's exactly what it was like. He could have made excuses about the weather, could have said conditions made it impossible. Instead, he just kept getting up and running again. 2 yards, 3 yards, whatever it took. The conversation reinforced something Bobby had been thinking about since the game. The relationship between struggle and achievement, the understanding that the most meaningful victories often came through perseverance rather than natural talent. That weekend, Bobby received a call from his older brother Tommy, who was serving in the Air Force and stationed in Germany. Tommy had seen highlights of Simpson's achievement on Armed Forces television and wanted to hear about it from someone who'd been there. "Little brother saw history being made," Tommy said, his voice crackling through the international connection. "Tell me everything." Bobby spent 20 minutes describing the game, but found himself focusing on the same details that had impressed his co-workers. The brutal conditions, Simpson's determination to keep fighting despite the circumstances, the visual transformation of his uniform from clean white to muddy brown. "You know what that reminds me of?" Tommy said when Bobby finished his account. "Basic training. When they put you through obstacle courses in the worst possible conditions, not because the obstacles are particularly difficult, but because they want to see if you'll quit when everything's working against you." "That's exactly what it was like," Bobby agreed. OJ was facing an obstacle course designed to make him fail, and he just refused to quit. "Those are the victories that matter most," Tommy replied. "Anyone can succeed when conditions are perfect. Champions are made when everything's working against them." The conversation with his brother helped Bobby understand why Simpson's muddy uniform had resonated with him more than the statistical achievement. The record was impressive, but the mud represented something deeper about character, determination, and the willingness to fight for your goals, regardless of the obstacles. Over the following months, as Bobby prepared for graduation and tried to decide between college and full-time work at the steel plant, he found himself thinking constantly about the lesson he'd learned from watching Simpson battle through impossible conditions. When he faced difficult decisions about his future, when he encountered setbacks that seemed overwhelming, when he was tempted to choose easier paths that required less struggle, he remembered the image of OJ. Simpson covered in mud, but still fighting for every yard. The decision to attend Buffalo State College on a partial academic scholarship was influenced directly by what he'd witnessed at Rich Stadium. The scholarship wouldn't cover all his expenses, meaning he'd have to work part-time and take out loans to finance his education. It would be 4 years of financial struggle, academic pressure, and uncertainty about whether the investment would pay off. But Bobby had learned something important about the relationship between struggle and achievement. Sometimes the most worthwhile goals required you to get muddy in the process. "You sure about college?" his father asked when Bobby announced his decision. "The plant's offering you full-time work, steady money, good benefits, secure future." "I'm sure, Dad," Bobby replied. "I learned something watching OJ that day. Sometimes you have to fight through difficult conditions to accomplish something important. College might be harder, but it's what I need to do." Walter Kowalski studied his son's face and saw the kind of determination that reminded him of his own youth, when choices between security and opportunity had seemed impossibly important. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "She always wanted you boys to have chances she never had." Bobby graduated from Buffalo State in 1977 with a degree in education and went on to teach high school history for 35 years. Throughout his career, he used the story of O.J. Simpson's 2,000-yard season as a teaching tool, helping students understand that significant achievements often required perseverance through difficult circumstances. "What's the most important lesson you learned from sports?" his students would ask during discussions about character and determination. That greatness isn't about making things look easy, Bobby would reply. It's about refusing to quit when everything's working against you. I once watched O.J. Simpson run for 2,000 yards in conditions that should have made it impossible. By the end of the game, his uniform was completely covered in mud, but he'd accomplished something that had never been done before. What did the mud represent? The price of excellence. The understanding that meaningful achievements require you to get dirty, to struggle, to fight for every inch of progress. In 2003, 30 years after Simpson's record-breaking performance, Bobby took his own children to a Bills game at what was now called Ralph Wilson Stadium. As they sat in similar seats to the ones he'd occupied in 1973, he told them about the day he'd learned that determination could triumph over impossible circumstances. The important thing wasn't the record itself, he explained to his daughter Sarah, who was considering whether to pursue a difficult pre-med program at college. The important thing was seeing what someone could accomplish when they refused to let conditions determine their outcomes. "Do you think less of O.J. now?" his son Michael asked, referencing the legal troubles and criminal trial that had overshadowed Simpson's athletic achievements. Bobby thought about the question. How do you separate athletic inspiration from personal disappointment? How do you maintain the value of a lesson learned from someone whose character had been called into question? "I think people are complicated," Bobby said finally. "What I saw that day in 1973 was a demonstration of athletic determination that taught me something important about perseverance. That lesson doesn't become less valuable because of things that happened later." When Bobby retired from teaching in 2012, his colleagues organized a retirement party where former students shared stories about lessons they'd learned in his classroom. Several mentioned his story about O.J. Simpson's muddy uniform and the understanding that excellence required struggle. "Mr. Kowalski taught us that the most important victories are often the ugly ones," said Maria Santos, who'd become a successful engineer after struggling through a difficult childhood. "He showed us that getting muddy in pursuit of your goals isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of." When Bobby died in 2018 at age 64, his family found among his possessions a small piece of artificial turf that he'd somehow obtained from Rich Stadium's renovation in the 1980s. The turf was mounted in a simple frame alongside a photograph of O.J. Simpson from the 1973 season and a handwritten note that read, "December 16th, 1973, the day I learned that greatness isn't about avoiding struggle, it's about embracing it. O.J. Simpson taught me that meaningful achievements require you to get muddy, to fight for every yard, to refuse to quit when everything's working against you. Sometimes $7 buys you 3 hours of entertainment. Sometimes it buys you a lifetime of understanding about determination and character." The story of O.J. Simpson's 2,000-yard season remained part of NFL folklore, celebrated as one of the greatest individual achievements in professional football history. The record itself was eventually broken by Eric Dickerson in 1984, but under much more favorable conditions that highlighted the extraordinary nature of what Simpson had accomplished in the brutal weather of December 16th, 1973. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the battle against impossible conditions, who had seen what determination looked like when everything was working against success, the muddy uniform remained the most powerful symbol of what had been accomplished. Bobby Kowalski had spent $7 to watch a football game and instead had witnessed a demonstration of what was possible when someone refused to let circumstances dictate outcomes. He had learned that excellence often emerged not from perfect conditions, but from the willingness to fight for your goals, regardless of the obstacles. At Bobby's funeral, His former principal, Dr. Elizabeth Harris, spoke about his 35 years of teaching and the countless students whose lives he'd influenced through his commitment to education and character development. Bobby understood something that many people never learn, Dr. Harris said to the packed auditorium. He understood that the most valuable lessons often come from watching people struggle toward their goals, rather than from seeing them achieve easy victories. His story about O.J. Simpson's muddy uniform taught hundreds of students that excellence requires persistence through difficult circumstances. After the service, Bobby's son Michael approached several of his father's former students who had attended the funeral. He wanted to understand how his father's teaching had influenced their lives, how the lessons about determination and character had been applied beyond the classroom. "Your father saved my life," said James Rodriguez, who had become a successful businessman after growing up in poverty in Buffalo's East Side. "I was ready to drop out of high school, convinced that someone from my background couldn't succeed in college. Then Mr. Kowalski told us about watching O.J. Simpson fight through impossible conditions to achieve something that had never been done before. He taught us that struggle wasn't something to avoid. It was something to embrace as part of achieving your goals." "What specifically did he say?" Michael asked. "He said that watching O.J.'s uniform get covered with mud taught him more about character than watching him break the record. He said meaningful achievements require you to get dirty, to fight for every yard, to refuse to quit when everything's working against you. That lesson got me through college, through building my business, through every challenge I've faced since high school." Similar stories emerged from other former students, all of whom referenced Bobby's ability to find profound lessons in athletic achievements, particularly his understanding that struggle was often more instructive than success. The piece of artificial turf from Rich Stadium remained in its frame in Michael's home office, along with his father's teaching materials and the countless thank you letters from students whose lives had been influenced by Bobby's commitment to character education. In 2023, 50 years after O.J. Simpson's historic achievement, Buffalo sports historians organized a commemoration of the 2,000-yard season. Michael was invited to speak about his father's experience at the game and how it had influenced his subsequent career as an educator. "My father spent $7 to watch a football game," Michael told the audience at the Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame. But what he really bought was a lesson about the relationship between struggle and achievement that he shared with students for 35 years. He learned that greatness isn't about avoiding difficult conditions, it's about refusing to let those conditions prevent you from pursuing your goals. "What was the most important part of the lesson?" asked a young teacher in the audience. "That the mud on O.J.'s uniform was more significant than the record itself," Michael replied. "The record showed what he accomplished. The mud showed what it cost him. My father believed that understanding the cost of achievement was more valuable than simply celebrating the achievement itself." The lesson passed down through generations of Bobby Kowalski's students, along with the understanding that meaningful victories often required persistence through difficult circumstances, that excellence emerged from the willingness to fight for your goals regardless of the obstacles. O.J. Simpson had rushed for 2,003 yards on December 16, 1973, becoming the first player in NFL history to break the 2,000-yard barrier. The achievement was remarkable, historic, worthy of celebration and analysis. But Bobby Kowalski had learned something more valuable from watching the struggle than from witnessing the success. He had learned that determination could triumph over impossible circumstances, that character was revealed through adversity, that the most important victories were often the ugly ones. Sometimes $7 buys you 3 hours of entertainment. Sometimes it buys you a lifetime of understanding about what it means to fight for excellence when everything seems designed to prevent you from achieving it. Sometimes, the mud on someone's uniform teaches more valuable lessons than all the highlight reels and record books combined. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to spend 35 years sharing that lesson with young people who need to understand that struggle isn't something to avoid. It's something to embrace as an essential part of achieving anything worthwhile.